they could not stop her from writing. And that was her passion. And aren't we so lucky that she was not deterred and wrote as much as she did, and that now this generation and the generations to come will be able to enjoy the genius of her.
Here we are in Cleveland, Ohio, for our second conversation with pianist Michelle Cann, this time looking at the life and music of Florence Price, a composer now closely associated with Michelle. Here, in the beautiful University Circle District, home to the Cleveland Orchestra and the Cleveland Institute of Music, we talk about an extraordinary composer whose music is finally being heard around the world.
I'm Michelle Cann, and this is Living the Classical Life.
So welcome to the show, Michelle. Here we are in Harkness Chapel on the campus of where we went to school.
I know, and so many memories in this chapel. It's definitely a multi-use facility here. It's like I've been in here for recitals, classes.
And it's one of my favorite pianos in all of Cleveland.
Oh, that's great.
And Michelle, I was just telling you earlier that this summer I was overseas in Europe, and I tuned into a broadcast of your performance with the Grant Park Festival Orchestra. Did I get that right?
Oh,
From
yeah.
Chicago.
It's in Chicago. You have that part right.
Yeah. And you were performing a piece which has become very closely associated with your name and your work, the Florence Price Piano Concerto in one movement.
One movement, but feels like three. But
Exactly, exactly. Michelle, I was mesmerized by you saying that you feel connected on the level of soul with Florence Price. You've played her concerto and you've played solo works. Is there like a musical theme that just comes to you when you think of Florence Price? Is she represented in your mind by a certain theme? When I think of Tchaikovsky, yeah, there are a few melodies. When it's Florence Price, what do you think of?
You know, I will say it's a good question. Never been asked that, but I have an answer very quickly. I would definitely say that the opening theme of the second movement of her piano sonata. 100%.
What does that sound like?
I'll play it for you.
I don't think I've heard the piano sonata.
You should. It's such a great piece. It's one of, I think, the best piano works that she wrote. And actually, she won a competition in 1932 in which she had submitted two pieces, the symphony in E minor, and that's what got premiered with Frederick Stock and the Chicago Symphony. She made history as the first African-American female to have a piece performed by a major symphony orchestra, and it was huge. In this competition, she also submitted the piano sonata and won top prize. So it was literally chosen as one of her top pieces, but it truly, the second movement is one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever played.
How old was she about when she wrote
She was in her
this?
40s. Yeah, when this
I don't know
when a lot
this.
of this happened. It's just the opening.
Tell me more about this piece, the Sonata. Why don't more people know it? Why don't more people play it?
That's how I felt in 2016 when I first came to know the name Florence Price. And 2016 really wasn't that long ago. So, especially compared to when she wrote the piece in the 1930s. That answer is definitely connected to her experience in history in America at that time. It was already difficult going back to composers like Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn. I mean, we're going back, even hundreds of years, in which females were not meant to be composers, right? It was fine for them to perform. They could be a pianist, and that was dignified. But the title of composer, that was not a place for females. And so, even as we get into the 20s and the 30s, and when Florence Price was very busy composing, unfortunately, that sentiment had not changed very much. We still had very little American female composers that we could speak of to date at that point. Amy Beach was one, but there weren't many names. And then on top of that, she was a black woman. She was a black woman, and to deal with the racism, I mean, quite frankly, she, having been born in Little Rock, Arkansas, tried to have her life, career, or such happen down there. And it was for the Jim Crow laws of segregation that was taking, a very strong hold in the South, that she had to go to Chicago in the first place. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have moved there. She loved the South. So when you think that, okay, so she's literally dealing with like spaces where she can't even use the same bathroom, and she's trying to be a composer. So all of that is what came together into, really the tragedy of her situation, which is, Chicago, Frederick Stock was really a supporter and, in a certain sense, ally of black composers, and was behind helping this happen. Yes, definitely was helpful and had various premieres when he was a conductor. But to be frank, when she sent her symphony, which, again, Chicago had played, they easily could have called Frederick Stock, conductors, and what do you think of this symphony by Florence Price? I imagine these moments in which, they could have inquired, they could have looked at the music. She sent music out, and it was either sent right back. She was denied by every major orchestra in the United States, other than Chicago. And so in her lifetime, no one ever played her music. Nothing. When I played the piano concerto at the beginning of, I can't even keep track of the years anymore, 2021, with the Philadelphia Orchestra, when I played in 2021 with them, and I did, in their digital stage, of course, it was, everything was recorded then, the Florence Price concerto, that was only the second piece that they'd ever played by her. And to be clear, the first piece was played 2 months before. So that 2021, essentially, was the first time the Philadelphia Orchestra, in the history of that orchestra, had ever played any Florence Price. Cleveland orchestras, no different, and you can name them all. They'd never played a note of hers, and she wrote 4 symphonies and many other things. So when you look at this and see the obstacles that she wasn't even able to fully, jump through, and she died in the 50s. And then a lot of her music also went unpublished. She also couldn't get publishing companies to publish all of her music. So then no one's distributing it. There isn't multiple copies. There's the copies she did by hand. So that's a big part of the story. Basically, a lot of her music just was lost, or, sitting in somebody's bench, probably piano bench, friends or whatever. And it wasn't until 2009 that they discovered, in this amazing story of them finding her music in the attic of her old summer home. This couple finds these boxes of Florence Price, and one of those things was a piano concerto that nobody had seen for decades. So, at any rate, this is exciting, news, basically. And it's what, this is what inspired the rebirth and sort of the renaissance of Florence Price. And we go on from there. So anyway, you hear the story, and it's not surprising for you to tell me that you don't know this sonata and you know very little.
What was Florence Price's relationship to I mean, she obviously saw her output not being performed. What was her relationship to that?
I can only speculate. What I can say is I am inspired by her strength because in the face of so much rejection, she kept writing. That much I know. She definitely had acceptance in Chicago and some other surrounding places. So it wasn't that her music wasn't played at all, but she kept writing. She wrote, as I said, her catalog is huge. I mean, 4 symphonies, 3 piano concertos, I think 3 violin concertos, or at least 2. Countless piano works, character pieces. Chamber music is vast, 3 piano quintets, string quartets, music for piano and voice. I mean, she wrote for pretty much every category and kept writing and kept writing. Because you know what? You can't, it doesn't matter what, if someone has something to say and if they have the means to put notes on a page, they're gonna do it. They couldn't stop her from doing that. They could stop anyone from really hearing it. They could stop it from being mass produced and shared. But they could not stop her from writing. And that was her passion. And aren't we so lucky that she was not deterred and wrote as much as she did, and that now this generation and the generations to come will be able to enjoy the genius of her.
We've established that her music wasn't performed for very specific reasons. And I think the next question is difficult, but I'm going to ask it because I know that you have an answer for it. Let's say an audience member comes up to you and says, okay, you're playing pieces by underrepresented voices, and you're doing that now because it's trendy to do so. What's your response to that?
That's a good question, but it's not the question for me. Because, first of all, I live it. I'm a Black female pianist. I live this. There's nothing about it that would be trendy because I've dealt with, my whole life in the classical music world feeling the fact that I was different, feeling the fact that I had to prove myself even more because classical music wasn't the space for people that look like me, especially not on piano. I used to be asked all the time when I would step into a space, and I still do to this day, oh, are you a vocalist? Oh, you're a singer? And this is just the immediate assumption for African-American, classical artists that if you're successful in the field, you must be singing. And people don't even realize exactly how discriminative that is sometimes when they say it. It's very innocent. So I've always felt that I had to work harder, to prove, to push, to whatever. And that's my reality. And the idea, which is interesting, about it being trendy, if someone had asked me that, said, well, not only have I lived it, but I was promoting Florence Price when it wasn't trendy. In 2016, it definitely wasn't trendy, if you want to call it. And I know what you're talking about, because what was very interesting was there's the side, and I get this, speaking with other musicians of color, in a way it was eye-opening and in certain ways frustrating because we have, as artists that, quite simply are trying to promote good music. And when I found out about Florence Price in 2016, I was pushing and pushing, and nobody wanted to play the piano concerto. None of the orchestras were interested that were contacted about it. People liked it when they heard it, but it wasn't trendy. And then it wasn't until with the pandemic and the incident with George Floyd, which quite simply was so horrifying that I think everyone's eyes were open in different ways, that we suddenly saw, as again, Black musicians who had been promoting, other Black voices for as long as they could, suddenly saw the shift where it became, we need to, everybody sort of looked at their own organizations and their own situations and saw the problems that had been this way for years and years and years, in which there was just obvious holes in equality, right? I mean, this stuff was there. The only difference was that people then were forced to look. Because before, they just didn't have to. They didn't have to care. Then it became, well, you have to care now. Do you see what I mean? It just became this pressure to look around and say, wait, we haven't been inclusive, right? So then suddenly it was, well, we need to be inclusive, so who's around there that we can include? So of course Black musicians realized this shift, realized this like, oh, now we care about you. Now we care about the composers you've been trying to promote all these years. So, my question would be, how genuine was that? Now, in some ways, it is. And for some, it absolutely is genuine, and they really saw things for what they were. And the people that ask that question, is it trendy? The word trendy, for sure, there's people who are just jumping on that bandwagon, but that's just the way it is.
And I want to be careful how I represent this, because it's not just musicians and composers of color that you've been highlighting.
Of course.
It's female composers, Clara
Yes.
Schumann and so forth. How do we go about doing this, as you say, in a genuine manner and having people paying attention and not resorting to, here's a word that I had to learn a little bit, tokenism.
Absolutely.
Right? This isn't just the token Black composer. This
Yes.
isn't just the token Black performer.
Yes.
How do we bring forth an issue, providing a platform, and also not having less enlightened people not have a backlash? Do you understand what I'm sort of getting at?
Oh, absolutely. The problem is, what I've come to learn is that on one side, people will always, especially if they have their own issues with their own sort of discriminatory thoughts, there will always be people who just have, the negative thing to say, or to say, oh, you're just doing this because you're trying to, make a point. And it's like, so there's some people, and you'll never change their mind, right? But I think that for the field, because I don't care about those people in that sense. Like, I don't care if you want to focus on that, because I can't change the way you choose to think. But what really matters in the field, and what I think that we should promote, is it's always been and always should be about the music and the stories that are told. Florence Price literally said, in her own words, in a letter to a conductor, can you please forgive the handicap, she had to use this word, of my race and gender, and look past that, right? And I'm not quoting her verbatim, but that's essentially what she said. Oh yeah, the handicap of my race and gender. Can you look past that and look at the music, please? So if she was begging for this in the 30s, that tells you where we really need to get to. There's nothing wrong with embracing, really we should embrace and appreciate the variety and the diversity of cultures in America. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I don't think that there serves anybody by being colorblind. I don't believe in that either. I don't think there's anything wrong with embracing that there are so many different cultures and people, but here's the thing, we're all unified in music. That it's not about that. We can embrace it, we can appreciate that. We can appreciate the variety, but we can't stop there. It's when we stop there is when we get the problem. Because for me, you're absolutely right. I promote Florence Price, not just because she is this phenomenal Black female that does inspire me. I mean, 100%. But she should inspire everybody, not just me. But really, I promote her because of the music. It doesn't matter. Any performance I do, I will talk about her story, and I'll tell the whole story, and then I always end it with, but listen to this music. Because that's what matters. I promote good music. If I feel like it means something to me and it's good and it has something to say just in the notes, that's what I promote. And I don't care what color your skin is. And, because it doesn't mean, and that's the other side of it, this idea that we are, as musicians, making our decisions based on race or color or culture. That's ridiculous. Because I'm sure I can come across a composer of color whose music I'm not the biggest fan of, and I probably won't promote it because it's just not for me, right? No offense, maybe it's just not for me. I'm not just going to do that in this assumption on either side that I will promote the music because it's a Black composer. That's ridiculous. So I do believe that when I look at, sometimes it takes tragedy for change, right? So yes, there was a very big push after the George Floyd incident to, look within organizations, and changes were made. And yeah, I think it did come across. I mean, there was kind of no way around it. When you haven't been doing something for years and everybody tries to make a difference and change the way they've been doing things all at the same time, it can come across to the naysayers as like, oh, it's just because of the trendiness or, tokenism, whatever. It's like, if you choose to focus on that, go ahead and focus on that. But the real point is that we have to get to a point where we don't need to sit there and suddenly say, oh, here's Mexican music for, whatever. Oh, here's, Asian music. And we need to be at a place where orchestras and, conservatories and teachers assign music for music. We don't put a box in the corner with music by Black composers. And here's the box by music for Latin American composers. Here's the box for Asian American composers. And here's everything else. This is ridiculous. Take the boxes, mix all the music together, and start making programs based on actual, what the music has to say. Tell a story. Give us something. Program, because the music makes sense to put together. That's what we need.
How have people responded to this? Have people been responding on the level of falling in love with the great music?
As I know they will, because I don't promote things that I don't think I can. And again, as a performer, you should play things that you feel connected to, because you can convince almost anybody of a piece when you are compelling. It's so funny how that is. I find that to be the case all the time. There'll be pieces where I'm like, oh, I do not like this. And then I go to a performance, and that performer is so keyed in and like loves the music they're playing. And I suddenly find myself like, oh, the piece not so bad, right? They sold it for us.
They sold it. And I'm going to take this one step further, because on that radio broadcast, one thing that you did was you addressed, with your own words and your voice, the audience about both the concerto and then your encore. If you had words of advice for young people who want to be in your shoes, do we have to have the words to back up our narrative?
I mean, not everyone is as comfortable, and I know this is the case, with speaking publicly, right? I mean, that's one way that I express myself, and that is something I enjoy doing.
Was it always that way for you?
Somewhat, yeah. I've always been. My father is a music conductor and music teacher, and he always would speak to the audience in a very compelling way, and I, looked up to him a lot. So I think we had a certain comfort in watching him do this. But for those that don't, I always say that, there's different ways to connect with audiences, and I think, you have to be a little bit creative and figure out, maybe for you, you don't say too much, or you say a few things, but it's really about collaborations that you may do with, like, cross genres or media or different things. It's so interesting seeing how people are actually presenting in different ways. But even if you present in the traditional manner, then sometimes, just the programming that you picked is so interesting. And then, of course, the most important thing, no matter whether or not you speak or you collaborate or whatever, is that you speak so convincingly through the music. That if you do that, that sticks in people's mind. If you put your soul and your heart into, your instrument, that translates. That completely translates to an audience, because we all understand when it reaches our hearts. We get it. So, I know the most important thing, for performers to, be honest and genuine in their performances. But, the other question, and it's an interesting point, which is why I said all the music needs to be put in one place and we just enjoy good music. Because there's also the issue of feeling like, for instance, it's Florence Price Concerto. Well, we should make sure we get a Black pianist, or especially Black female, or a Black pianist to play this. Why?
Why?
That's not what Florence Price wanted. That's not ultimately what she wanted. That her music was only allowed to be performed by Black artists. Again, we get nowhere when it's like that.
You see, I had never considered that.
It's the other side of it, right? And so, but I noticed this where people feel like, oh, I don't know if I can play this. I don't really understand it, Okay, so what about when you first learned Beethoven in his language? Did you understand it at the beginning? Well, no, you had to get to know his music. and you learned and you grew, right? It's the same thing with any composer that's new to you, is that you get to know the music, you grow, you get to know what the influences are in the music, and you listen to that music, and then you incorporate that into your performance. And so that to me is another side of, as we look to the future, is not only to say that we don't keep doing these, as you said, tokenism, which can come in the form of, very specifically making a program because it's Black History Month,
yeah.
or now Juneteenth, that's the next, now it's 2 months, it's like when, oh, okay, now we can, Michelle, we'll bring you June or February. You know what I mean? It's like this kind of foolishness where, not to say that you can't, to celebrate these Juneteenth and Black History Month, nothing wrong with that. The problem is when it gets delegated to that's when we do this music, and that's the only time we do it. So that's one side, and then the other side of it is who's playing the music. We have to normalize anyone playing good music, no matter who wrote it.
You mentioned it here earlier, but you've spelled it out more elsewhere. One of the things you've often said to me, and I've always been very touched and flattered, is that you're a little bit younger than I am. You said you always looked up to me as a pianist. I've received that, and I say thank you. But it's gotten to the point now, looking at what you've achieved and where you are, I look up to you and admire everything that you've been doing. So I wanted to say thank you for being a great example of everything to us.
Oh, thanks. That means a lot to me coming from you. You're one of my favorite people, honestly, and always have been. So it's just really a pleasure.
Thanks so much for being here on the show, Michelle. It's been absolutely a thrill
to
finally make this happen.
Yes. Thank you
so much.